learner in the rise and fall of verb-second. So this work represents a continuation of what we both presented at last digs in Arizona 2 years ago, where I presented on Old French, change in Old French, and Ailís, together with Naomi Lee, presented on the relation between child first language acquisition and language change. So these are our research questions. What syntactic account of verb-second allows us to capture synchronic syntactic patterns, attested learning pathways, and diachronic patterns? And we will argue that adopting a feature bundling approach to the left periphery is the approach that best allows us to account for all three of these domains. And then secondly, we asked the question, could child learners drive these well-attested changes? In other words, do children do the kind of innovative things in the predicted ways to drive diachronically the rise and fall of verb-second grammars? And of course, we'll argue that this is the case, but not so much through the children being innovative as through some conservatism on their part with respect to child structure, projection, and movement postulation. So verb-second, you all know this so well that I won't burden you with many examples. This talk, by the way, and I apologize in advance, will not be very data heavy. We will focus on the theory itself. But as you know, in descriptive terms, V2 is a word only constraint. All modern Germanic languages except English, which requires the finite verb to be in the second position of the main clause. So the true hallmark of V2 is the inversion string XP, auxiliary verb, subject, lexical verb, or G inversion, which is distinct from many other inversion types where the subject follows both the auxiliary verb and the lexical verb. So here is a minimal pair from the Norwegian and Italian. So this house has my father built, literally, and questa casa l'ha fatto mio padre in Italian, with the subject following both verbs. So with some exceptions, well known, the canon must be exactly one XP in front of the verb, and this XP can have many different kinds of information structural readings. So the facts that we want to account for are quite simply the syntactic position of the verb and this restriction to a single preverbal constituent, and this very, very, very flexible information structure that it carries. And the thing is that there has been a consensus since Den Besten that verb-second is derived somehow through V2C movement. But life was simpler in the 1980s and 1990s because when you worked within a single CP model, that kind of explained the linear restriction to a single constituent. But since Rizzi, there is a growing agreement that the C domain is just a shorthand for many, many projections. Here are just a handful of references. And furthermore, most versions of cartography adhere to this tenet of one feature, one head, which means that different projections, there will be different projections for all kinds of topics and foci, etc., which means that the left periphery easily grows very rich. And this is very hard to reconcile with the facts of V2. But why would there be only one constituent in front of the verb? And what does V2C movement even entail? So to give you a scope of the problem, this is Rizzi's 1997 proposal, where it's already not clear what V2C would mean. And Rizzi and Bocci 2013 is much more elaborate. And my guess is that these structures will only grow in the future. So what does V2C movement mean? And why should there be only one constituent in front of the verb? Now, one possible answer to this, and the one we'll adopt, is that some features can be bundled on a single head, which is a phenomenon that has been called syncretism or conflation in the literature. And most recent approaches assume that the projections in the left periphery do in fact exist in the order revealed by cartography, but that certain features may be bundled on a single head. So that gives the prediction that what can be bundled must be adjacent features of the cartographic sequence. And this is the approach that we adopt, but nothing crucially hinges on that assumption, I think. So we think that the left periphery of a strict V2 language will look like this simply. We've chosen the lowest left peripheral head, obviously because all of the kinds of projections that are attested in the left peripheral in other languages are available. I mean, all those readings are available to the single preverbal constituent in the Germanic languages. So Fin plus just indicates that this is FinP, but with a feature bundle. And topic and focus are, of course, shorthands for all kinds of topics and foci here. Of course, you cannot merge a bundled head in the derivation as such, but you must select a single feature for each sentence. So how does it work? It's very well known. It's the old single CP model in a sense, just with additional features. So if you have an additional TP, my father has built this house, could well be that that's just a TP in Norwegian at least. And if you want to topicalize the house, then of course you merge a Fin plus head with a topic feature. The verb moves and the house moves to the topic position in the spec FinP. So what are the kind of changes we are focused on? Specifically, the rise of V2, the genesis of V2C and the feature bundle, where we will present 13th century Old French as a brief case study. And then secondly, the fall of V2, which we will argue is not due to unbundling, but rather due to the loss of V2C. And we will have a look again briefly at Germanic urban vernaculars. And now I will pass the word to Ailís, who will talk a bit about our linking theory.
Hi. So our linking theory for putting together these syntactic changes with what we see in child language relies on a few assumptions. So one is that any input divergent grammatical representation is an innovation. So on this definition, all child learners are innovators on their learning path. If they do something in their syntactic analyses that is not in the input grammars, then it is an input divergence and it's an innovation. So children, but we know that children are actually quite conservative about committing to grammars. So they'll kind of hold on to older grammars and really wait for unambiguous evidence for making any further decisions. And notice that along the learning path, learners are really, really good. So most innovations, most input divergences are going to be overwritten by further learning from the input. That's going to be the usual fate. But as children learn more about the target grammar from their input, we know they don't simply abandon the prior reanalysis. So we don't get this on-off that we might expect with a really strong parameter switching. Rather, they keep using the developmentally earlier stages. So they're also conservative in this way. They kind of hold on to their early analyses as they start using the newer ones. So that children produce output from their learning path grammars perhaps might invite actuation of an innovation. So it might invite the spread of that innovation and the catching on of that innovation in the speech community. Why might that be? Well, children's productions may provide input to their peer learners. And this is especially promising when children are a little bit older than age 4 or around age 4, because that's when children peer align. So we see what Labov has called vernacular reorganization, which is really they start to care about talking like their peers and not like adult speakers around them. We can also expect that children from the same community are learning from similar input, and this increases the likelihood that the innovations that they make are going to be reinforced by their peers who may have made the same innovations along their learning path. Note, of course, that actuation, so the spread of an innovation and it actually catching on, may occur even if children eventually also attain input convergence along their learning path. There, we just expect children to exhibit intra-speaker variation, the innovative grammar, and the conservative one that they learned a little later. So our proposals in a nutshell: for the rise of V2, we are arguing that children are conservative structure builders. They're going to prefer to bundle features unless proven otherwise. So children maintaining a developmentally earlier bundled left periphery stage without unbundling it. This is going to give a V2 grammar from the learning path, from the regular learning path of an articulated left periphery language, like modern Italian. And then for the loss of V2, children are conservative movers. We know they prefer to move as little as possible until proven otherwise. So children maintaining a developmentally earlier V to T stage with a little bit less movement will give us these V3 grammars from the first language learning path of a learning a V2 language.
Right, so our first case study then is the rise of V2 in Old French, which I will present relatively briefly because I presented on this last time in DIGS, and we want to get back to the actual acquisition theory. So just some context for you. The Old Romance languages featured subject-verb inversions of a kind that are not possible in the modern descendants. Here is an example from Old Spanish that is not met with enthusiasm from modern Spanish speakers. After that they had left, sent the king of Navarra, literally his messengers, to the lady. Now, there has been a lot of evidence suggesting that generalized inversion of some kind was a pan-Romance phenomenon. So supposedly it is attested for all of the Old Romance languages out there, simply. Lots of work on this. We should note, of course, that not all researchers agree that the Old Romance languages were V2 languages by definition, nor even that they did feature across the B2C movement. So pan-Romance inversion suggests internal development in the family, right? And this hypothesis is corroborated by recent work on 1st century late Latin by myself and Ledgway. Looked at the same text. And you find lots of inversion structures in the Itinerarium Egeriae, for instance. So here, while we were walking, advised the priest. That does not mean that the pre-field is restricted in any sense. So here you have, thus for 2 days there held us the holy bishop, another example. So on the whole, there is some evidence to say that late Latin developed into some kind of verb initial grammar. And perhaps featuring V2C movement. Beninca noticed already in 1984 that Old French was special within Old Romance in generally allowing a single preverbal XP, with very few restrictions, while the others had linear V3, 4, or even more. Here is a strict V2 example from Old French, because no is cyclitic. Other thing could the king not find. And here is an example from Old Sicilian cited by Wolff, which otherwise shows inversion structures of all kinds. But here you have 3 constituents in front of the verb. After their deaths, their bones by virtue divine perform miracles. So how to account for this typological split? And before I go on to that, just a little caveat. Old French was not as strict as modern Germanic because in spite of the general restriction, there was in fact a deviation from linear V2 in a particular context, namely in the case of an initial subordinate clause. So this is what you find a lot in Old French. When he had everything told, his wife cried and told him, which is the kind of structure that we saw in Breitbach's talk, and which might in fact not, where the V2 grammar perhaps is an innovation in Germanic as well, the tendency to invert after these clauses. And this is the same V2 construction we will observe for modern Germanic urban vernaculars. So for lax V2, you can simply say that the verb moves to a low peripheral head, and you get the explanation from an articulated left periphery. And from Old French, again, we assume a feature bundle. But the question is, how did Old French become so strict, and where does the feature bundle come from? So I've suggested last time in DIGS, and now on paper, in print, that it was due to prolonged bilingualism in Merovingian Gaul. We know, although we're in the dark with respect to details, that there must have been an extensive period of bilingualism involving a first stage of second language acquisition, coupled with a gradual increase in bilingual first language acquisition. And if we assume that Old Franconian was the verb-second language itself, the differences between the 2 languages would have been very subtle, because they would both have had V2C, whereas the only difference would be that Old Franconian would front a single XP in most cases. And then the idea is that prolonged bilingualism and second language acquisition may have caused interference effects, but particularly imposition in the sense of Van Kutzel. And the position is well documented in the domain of V2 by Ute Bonacker and Christina Rosén, who have shown in several studies that adult Swedes learning German impose native tendencies in the prefold and the other way around. We also know that cross-linguistic transfer and acquisition is triggered by overlap in input structures, which fits nicely with this story, because between the two languages, imposition of a linear V2 constraint would be simply the lowest common denominator and would not violate anything in early Gallo-Roman. But the second stage would be, of course, when bilingual first language acquisition becomes more important. We know there are many indications that the initial segregation of the groups waned away. There were no religious barriers between them. The word Frank takes on a new meaning and refers to both of the entire population of Northern Gaul. Separate burials cease. So by late Merovingian times, the two populations had started to merge, and that's the demise of Gaul and Franconian. And now Ailís will talk a bit about this bilingual first language acquisition scenario.
Well, so if we put together the diachronic pathway that we see for the rise of V2, we go from a first stage where we have an articulated left periphery to a bundled left periphery. In acquisition, we'll argue that kids start with this bundled left periphery and only unbundle when they have evidence. So you'll see we have kind of oppositional pathways here for what we see in diachrony versus what we see in development. So children are learning from speakers using the unbundled left periphery, but children will go through a stage where they have the bundled left periphery. And notice the little speech bubble shows here that kids are going to use both of these. This is consistent with what we see children doing. Now, if children are using both of these grammars, so especially and importantly, their earlier bundled grammar, they may peer-to-peer reinforce because many kids learning from the same input are going to make the same initial assumptions. And then we may expect the change to actually actuate and create from the child's earlier learning path stage, the more innovative diachronic stage of the change. So, but the big question here is, does child language show evidence of bundled stages for phrases that are unique projections in the target language? More broadly, do developmental linguists argue for child conservativity of projection? And here, the answer is a pretty clear yes for several research studies, specifically arguing that earlier bundling stages later, by different cues from the input, provide evidence for unbundling. Most of this work, however, has been done in the DP domain. Looking at CP, children also show several different phenomena that are often analyzed as the absence of much of or the whole left periphery. But there's really a lot of caveats here. So child production data is very opaque, so it's open to analysis. So what counts for bundled heads that are not like the target grammar versus the absence of some or all of those heads? How can we tell apart performance limitations from input divergence? I also want to note that children quite generally tend to opt for licensing heads that can do a superset of the work. So account for more strings in their input. This is usually cast as being underspecified heads, underspecified relative to the input, and can be viewed as an economical learning strategy. And this has been done for V2 by Sanfelici et al. To 2020. And then finally, we want to note that once a language is V2, like modern Germanic, it's actually remarkably learnable, especially for the root V2 phenomena. Even really tiny children, their productions are completely consistent with the input language and very sensitive to microvariation, like Marit Vestergaard's work has shown. So why would it get lost? Back to Espen.
Right, so let's have a look at a case study of loss of V2. Of course, it's just a loss in one sense, and you can ask us about that afterwards, because it's more than anything the rise of something new. Germanic urban vernaculars, which are varieties we've heard about already and which have drawn more attention over the last decades because they allow this particular kind of linear V3, which we have seen. attested mostly with multi-ethnic communities in urban areas, and now for most Germanic languages, in fact. So we adopt the term that George used in his 2017 paper, Germanic Urban Vernaculars. Their speakers are predominantly used from immigrant backgrounds, although many of them are born and raised in the country, in their respective countries, right? And they are multilingual in many senses. They're fluent in the standard or some local dialect, in addition to generally another first language. And they're capable of switching between the standard and the urban vernacular, and also of describing many of the properties that set this apart from the standard. And also note that the non-standard V3 orders are also attested, at least for some languages, I can say surely for Norwegian, among adolescents from non-immigrant backgrounds. So it might be on the move, and it's apparently becoming cool. So here are the V3 orders. You've already seen them, as I've said, so I can permit myself to be brief. They are extremely coherent across languages. As you can see, you have an initial adjunct of some kind of some sort, and then there is the subject and the verb in third position, right? So this adjunct is very often a temporal adverb or some other element which might serve as a scene setter, right? An argument fronting with V3 is often judged explicitly ungrammatical, but at the same time, all speakers also produce regular inverted veto clauses. So it's clearly not the case that V2C movement is generally lost across the board in these varieties. So two questions arise: how to analyze these strings and where do they come from? Of course, a possible analysis could be that there is an additional position activated in the left periphery, in other words, unbundling, or simply that the verb does not move. And we assume that it's the latter. So we opt in favor of only V to T movement. The arguments are, of course, mostly based on the fact that the directly preverbal argument is, I said invariably with a question mark because it's not entirely true, but generally the subject, and I believe that the exceptions are generally extensions of the general V2 grammar. We can get back to that point. And then secondly, these V3 orders are embeddable, at least in Norwegian. So I must say that sometimes I know not what is wrong with people. So it seems to us that a V2C model might overgenerate. Here we just name two different projections in the left periphery, and then you move the verb to the head of the first. If you have topicalization of the direct object, then why wouldn't you be able to first to base generate a frame on top of this, if this is the proper analysis? But clearly this is apparently not attested. So V to T would explain why subjects are preverbal, because if we just assume that this particular feature fails to trigger movement of the verb, then of course we can just put the initial clause into the same feature bundle that we've already postulated, and that explains the position of the subject, and also why the V3 strings are embeddable. Of course, here we have to make use of the force P projection, and that is always clear that you have to, even for the standard Germanic embedded V2 in Germanic. Right, so back to Ailís then.
So this we can do really, really quickly, because actually we have the exact same model we'll use here. So the conservative grammar has the movement all the way up to C, the innovative grammar only moves to T, and children show the opposite, initially assuming only movement to T and not yet to V. Children are going to use both of their learning path grammars for a period of time, and if and when they might peer reinforce that earlier grammar, it could catch on among the youth and actually actuate into the grammar, the diachronic grammars. Yeah. So do children show evidence for this? So do developmental linguists argue for child conservativity of movement? So yes, generally speaking, they do. Along the learning path for V2 languages of most relevance for us, Vestergaard and Benson, 2007, argue that Tromsø Norwegian learners initially seek to minimize movement and use V to T structures, V to T for structures it is string consistent with and persistently do so. And then Faroese learners also initially hypothesize more V to T than is warranted by the input. And Haycock and Wallenberg, looking at a slightly different loss of movement phenomenon, but along the spine, using Yang's variational learner, show we don't need to build in a bias against movement. Rather, learnability from the input word orders, and particularly those persistent consistent structures in the input, will do the work in preferring the non-movement structures for the final stage. And also note, of course, in generative theory, learner preference for non-movement is inferred from diachronic stages. So we infer that movement is lost, and that's done so by child learners. And why not unbundling from a first language perspective? Well, it's not predicted from the learning path of a conservative learner, and it's not consistent with first language acquisition production data throughout the first several years of life, even for rich left periphery languages. The child would have to be going beyond the input in unexpected, uncued, and liberal ways. Okay, so a quick note on actuation. So what might prolong the child's use of the bundled grammar in the rise of V2 or the V to T grammar in the loss of V2 long enough for actuation into the speech community? And why would some generation of children or learners do this and not the previous generation? That's the why of change. So we expect this to happen when there's less evidence, less robust evidence for those unambiguous cues for unbundling in the first case, or for V all the way up to C in the second case. And contact situations are going to precipitate this, or exacerbate this. And these situations, these contact situations, are present for both the changes that we've talked about, as Espen has talked about. And so bilingual acquisition situations are going to affect any aspect of grammar that's sensitive to the input amount, because the child gets less input in each of the languages. So we get some slowing of acquisition in exactly those cases, as we see in the bilingual literature, like De Hauer 2007. And also, if there are more and more L2 speakers in the child's environment, we know that children don't like to learn from them. They seem to know not to learn from them. And this would again reduce the input that children learn from, and may prolong their period of input divergence. So summarizing, I know we're over time. We've argued that adopting a bundling approach to the left periphery best allows us to account for all three empirical domains and how they dynamically interact. We've argued that the diachronic rise and fall of V2 grammars is tied to the conservative nature of child structure, projection, and movement postulation. And we've tried to support these stages from the first language acquisition literature. And then finally, also these are testable. We can test them with current kids. Ask if you're interested. And wrapping up, we see a four-way typology of languages. So the Germanic V2, we have a bundle and V to C movement. Maintaining the bundle but losing the V to C movement, we have something like modern English or modern French. Having no bundle and no V to C movement, we have something like modern Italian. And then for no bundle, we have relaxed V2 and Old Romance. But here, as Espen noted, it's debated whether there was actually V to C, but if so, that would fit in that cell. All right, thank you so much.